I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are checking in on Asia. And in particular, in Seoul, South Korea, there was recently an event held by the Global Privacy Assembly that was in September of 2025. And it was hosted by the Personal Information Protection Commission of Korea. And the theme was artificial intelligence and our daily lives, data and privacy issues. Now, what is interesting about the Global Privacy Assembly is that it's not just a conference for companies to share insights as to how they are managing compliance. But this is really designed to bring in regulators and enforcement authorities as a key stakeholder, and perhaps the key stakeholder, for them to be able to discuss how they are collectively managing policy and enforcement surrounding issues that we in the space are all dealing with. So I think the event touted maybe 140 or so data protection authorities from over 90 countries and focused on things like agentic AI and privacy enhancing technologies, cross-border data transfers, kids' privacy, all of those things. And so it was a really fascinating event. And one of the participants who went to it was our very own Eduardo Ustaran, who is my co-lead of the data privacy and cybersecurity practice here at Hogan Lovells. So I really want to hear from Eduardo about what his key takeaways are. And at the same time, I also invited Charmian to the podcast. You've met Charmian before on prior episodes, but Charmian is a partner in our Singapore office and leads our APAC privacy team. The two of them, I would really want to hear about not only what is happening in Asia, but to think about things from even a deeper, more important level. And that is, what can we learn from not only the Global Privacy Assembly, but to recent events that Charmian went to that would describe how companies can be able to create interoperability between differing and diverse sets of data protection laws. And that's really important for many of our global clients who are all struggling with trying to use a limited number of resources to be able to solve a diverse set of privacy laws that have a number of specific requirements. If you want to get a sense of how many different requirements in just the Asia Pac region, we also have a resource that may be really helpful for you. Our team in APAC, led by Charmian, recently launched the Asia Pacific Privacy Legislation Tracker, which is an online tool that will provide a comparison of the privacy laws in each of the jurisdictions across the APAC region. With governments taking different approaches to privacy and data regulation, staying informed is essential for regional and global compliance. Fortunately, the tracker gives organizations that type of clarity that they not only need to be able to stay in compliance with current laws, but also to stay ahead. So if you're looking for the link, you'll find it in the episode description. Please feel free to click on that, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'll make sure you'll be able to get that as a resource. That's a long lead in to a very important conversation. And so with that, I want to welcome Eduardo and Charmian to the podcast. So great to have you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
So, Eduardo, maybe I can start with you. One of the things that you had recently done is attended the Global Privacy Assembly that was held this year in Seoul. What were some of the key takeaways that you took from that conference? And in particular, I'm interested to hear about some of the themes and how those are applicable not only for businesses that are operating within Asia, but more globally.
Sure. Well, the Global Privacy Assembly is always a key, I think, event of the year, at least for the privacy geeks amongst us. And I say that because it's unique as an event. It is the only conference throughout the year that is organized by a regulator and is for regulators, but also for those who also want to attend some of the open sessions. So the level of discussion is certainly quite advanced and quite deep. And I've been going to many of these over the years, over the decades, I would say, and some are better than others, and there's always something good about them. But the one this year was interesting because, first of all, there was a thread across the whole of the conference and all of the sessions. And the thread was that this conference was meant to be a hub for collaboration about innovation. And innovation, particularly around AI, obviously, was the key factor in all of the discussions. Every single panel had a dimension to it that had to do with innovation. And the reason for that is that at the outset, the chair of the Korean Data Protection Authority said, look, this is a forum for collaboration, for discussion, but clearly AI is front of mind, is driving progress. And we as regulators and privacy, again, professionals attending these sessions need to also be at the forefront of that. And there was some form of acknowledgement by the regulators themselves that they had to facilitate innovation. So when you get data protection authorities, privacy regulators saying, look, we're here not to get in the way. We're here to do our job, obviously, but facilitating innovation. And then you get 2 or 3 days of discussion around that theme. That sets the ground for a very productive discussion.
So I'm interested, Eduardo, about what that actually means in practice, because I think at least the themes that have come out of the United States is that any type of regulation is effectively anti-innovation. And, there's some history to this because we have been in a situation in the mid to late 90s where we were at a reflection point about how is it that we were going to regulate the internet. And there were decisions that were being made around that. The United States pretty much took a hands-off approach, and Europe took a very kind of regulatory approach. China and others kind of took a much more authoritarian approach. And you ended up having very different innovation coming out of all three of those regions as a result. So when people describe what innovation is and how regulation can either support or impede innovation, I'm interested to getting to the next level. What does that actually mean when regulators say that they need to support innovation?
Sure. Yeah, obviously this is crucial then, because you have to go beyond the nice words. And the way they look at this is that when they talk about innovation, they are essentially talking about progress that benefits people as opposed to eroding rights and freedoms and certainly privacy. So progress and innovation in a way that is helpful to individuals. And in the context of a privacy conference, as you can imagine, which is run by privacy regulators, what they're trying to get across is that for them, innovation for the sake of technology advancing, in a sense, is a bit worthless. Innovation is there for is not an end in itself. Innovation is a means to prosperity, and prosperity means not just prosperity for the ones or two that make a lot of money, but also prosperity for humanity. So I guess it's a slightly philosophical way of looking at it, but I don't think it's particularly controversial. But of course, then in practice, that means that these regulators are saying, well, the data protection framework around the world, and remember, this is a debate taking place in Seoul, in Korea, but there are regulators from all over the world, certainly from Europe, from the Americas, from Asia, Middle East, Africa, the entire world. And they're saying, you need to be able to use this data protection framework that exists in order to enable that innovation to produce that result that we're looking for. And the framework itself has the tools to enable that. And I'll give you some examples that we're talking about. They were talking about data protection impact assessments or privacy impact assessments. They say this is a tool. In some cases, it may be a mandated tool to be used by law, but it's a tool that allows you to think about the privacy implications of that development so that if there are any risks, you can address them as part of the development. So what happens then, you have two choices. Let's say you develop AI in a way that says, well, don't worry about privacy. We'll think about it later. You do whatever you need to do. You collect all this data. You produce these clever models, and they produce the output. And then you say, oh, maybe we shouldn't have used this data because it's leading to these outcomes that are not necessarily beneficial. Or you can go down another route, which is, okay, you want to develop AI, think about these issues that data protection requires or makes you think about legitimacy and transparency and purpose limitation and data minimization and accuracy and integrity of the data, these kind of things. Think about how it affects the development and do the kind of things that are going to help you address those issues as the technology develops, so that when the technology is developed, which is more or less going to take you the same amount of time, the outputs are much more beneficial. So that's the mindset these guys are talking about, using these type of tools, talking about transparency, talking about allowing people to exercise their rights, but embedding that in the development process or in the deployment process. So that's the mindset that is trying to be put forward by this regulatory community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Eduardo, that you frame it that way, because when I say you frame it that way, I mean, kind of that's how it's being framed with inside of the conference and you're reporting about it. Because, while I understand and agree that many of the ways that data protection laws have been developed is it does provide a framework, does provide tools, does provide ways of creating something that would frankly result in more sustainability and more perseverance to be able to address regulatory change. But what we're also adding, and we have to be honest about this, is we're adding a lot of friction to the development process, right? Because what you are describing, and maybe what is a critical way of thinking about how these laws have developed, is we're talking about adding time, resources into the development stage, where many of the companies who are really at the forefront of putting out these types of technologies are not in the position of devoting those types of resources or dedicating that period of time. So what happens is that, the more responsible organizations of the world who have that type of resources, they add all of these friction points. They add all of this type of documentation, this type of governance, all of these various things, which are front and center of what it is to do. But those who don't have it, who don't have the time, don't have the resources, and are just looking to get a product out to market to create some sort of cash flow, they don't invest all of those resources. And maybe in some ways, then they have a competitive advantage in terms of getting out into the market because they're not stuck with all of this baggage that data protection laws, AI laws, all of the other ones that are being put up. I mean, I'm interested in whether that is truly adding all of this is thought of as pro-innovation.
Yeah, so it's a matter of how you look at it, in the sense that you could say, well, if I don't need to look at any rules whatsoever, I can focus 100% on doing this as fast as I can. And that's a school of thought. And imagine that you're building a road, a motorway or a highway, as you call it. And you could say, okay, well, all we want is put all the asphalt as quickly as possible so that cars can go as quickly as possible. And someone will say, okay, yeah, but a road in the 21st century, cars go really fast, so you might want to put some guardrails on the side. And you've got the choice of not putting the guardrails or putting them. If you put them, it's going to add to the construction, possibly the cost, and It may well be that depending on the resources you have, it may take you a bit more time to build the same road. But once you built it, which road do you think is going to not only be safer, but in fact allow the cars probably to go a bit faster just because it is safer, it is better built. So if you think about that analogy, this is a little bit what this is all about. It's not about creating friction for the sake of it. You could call it friction, but you could call it guardrails, or you could call it measures to allow this to work better, to be more beneficial. And I can try to convince you, or the regulators can try to convince us, and some people will be persuaded, others will not be persuaded. But when you look a little bit at the history of what has happened with digital developments, you can see very well where no guardrails have been built and things have allowed to happen, then not all the outcomes are positive. So it is just a matter of making sure that you look at this in a strategic way, not just in a sort of, okay, what's the fastest way we can build this technology in the same way the fastest way we can build this road. So it's just a matter of how you approach this and whether you've got perhaps a more long-term and sustainable approach to it, or whether you're just trying to win the race. But again, the race, is it a sprint or is it a marathon? So I think it does get a bit philosophical, but ultimately it's about making sure that these guardrails that you're building don't get in the way. If you put the guardrails in the middle of the road, sure, the cooks are not going to go in any direction. You have to then adapt the law to ensure that it doesn't get in the way of innovation in an unnecessary way. And that's what the debates were also about, how to ensure that if there is going to be a law, or if the law already exists and needs to be interpreted in a way that is pro-innovation, that interpretation is obviously adopted in that way, rather than saying, okay, I'm sorry, but you cannot do that. So then that is, again, the debate that is going on today amongst the regulatory community, and I can see that.
So, Eduardo, I think those are really good points. And Charmian, I want to kind of bring you into this portion of the conversation, because what I hear Eduardo describing, right, is that this is these differences and decisions that are being made surrounding how we're going to regulate AI, how we're going to balance innovation versus regulation, are in some ways a reflection of the principles and the values that are inside of the communities that are embracing these rules, right? Eduardo mentioned at the start that the idea was to create technology for the benefit of people. And that is definitely true, but I would say it's probably a little bit more of a way of thinking about it in the EU or UK, because I would think that, China would think about technology around the development for purposes of advancing the state. The United States, we may think about technology for purposes of creating more economic development and more industry and employment than we would necessarily saying it's just for purposes of the people. So those themes really are at the cutting edge of how we are making these decisions. And the thing is that if we can't really agree on the themes, we can't really agree as to why we're doing this, then trying to come up with one way of trying to address all of these things is near impossible. So I guess maybe, Charmian, from your perspective, sitting in Singapore, I know Singapore has very specific views about how you would want to approach regulation, and in particular, creating a framework that will be, in some ways allow for industry to continue to develop. Interested in what you're seeing on the ground there and how Singapore is playing in to this global debate that Eduardo was framing.
Yes, thanks so much, Scott. And I totally echo what Eduardo said in terms of observations of the region. If I were to bring it into Singapore more specifically, I think we are looking at ourselves to be a regional anchor for stability in digital regulation. We are very much attuned to what's happening globally. Don't get me wrong. When we make policies, it's very much we are plugged into what's happening geopolitically, socioeconomically around the world and even in the region. But we do take a very carefully calibrated approach that works for us. We are a very small economy, but we do punch above our weight in terms of leading the conversations around digital governance and in particular AI governance. So Singapore was one of the first mover and shaker to actually publish one of the world's first AI model governance frameworks at the World Economic Forum. There is now a version 2.0, and Singapore is, continuing to kind of lead the conversations and the discussions around AI governance. But I think also just more broadly, coming to kind of coming back into the region and sort of even just globally, again, we are seeing kind of a role that Singapore plays, frankly, on the international scale. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about a forum that I just came back to Singapore from, which is the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum. Actually, it's held twice a year, and the first one this year in May was indeed in Singapore. And Singapore is the vice chair of this forum, with the United States being the chair. Unfortunately, because of the sort of ongoing government shutdown, the US wasn't able to attend in Boracay, which is the second forum, which just happened last week. But I think we do see very positive developments on the global CBPR, which I would like to share. But before that, what is the Global CBPR Forum? Well, it is looking to solve for the problems that, frankly, businesses and indeed regulators alike are grappling with, right? Which is the increasingly fragmented and complex landscape of global cross-border privacy rules. So there is basically a disparate fragmentation and patchwork of, what you need to do when you're transferring personal data from the US to elsewhere, right? Anywhere in Asia, from Canada to Mexico, from, Dubai to Malaysia, whatever, so on and so forth. And it's very, very cumbersome for a global business to have to navigate all these requirements at one time. And so the Global CBPR Forum offers two tiers. One is that it provides a unified certification framework that is recognized by multilateral parties within the forum. And in fact, just off the back of Boracay, there are indeed two new full members, at least two new full members, the DIFC, which is the Dubai International Financial Center, which is the first full member outside of the APAC region. So APAC meaning APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So anything from sort of straddling the Pacific, right? So you have some of the old members, the US and Mexico and Canada on one side, and then on the other side you have Asia, right? And Australia, etc. But DIFC is the first full member outside of that APAC region. We also have South Africa that is now a full member. So that was announced at the Boracay Forum, with associate members including the United Kingdom, which Eduardo will know, Nigeria, etc., and others looking to join. So there is active applications by, countries like Malaysia, etc., and I'm sure the list will increase in due course. The other aspect which I thought was very useful for our audience who are listening in to take note of with regards to the Global CBPR Forum is this thing called the Global CAPE, CAPE. And this is a multilateral mechanism for cooperation on a voluntary basis between privacy enforcement authorities. So this is essentially kind of like, if I were a privacy regulator in Singapore, I reach out to the US and I say, please, I need help. Please give me information, sharing of information around an enforcement case that I'm working on that involves the US and Singapore. And certainly the US is not necessarily obliged, but again, on a voluntary basis, would be able to provide me with that enforcement assistance.
What you're describing, coming from the conference that you went to in the Philippines, Charmian, is fascinating, especially because it follows on with some of the themes that Eduardo was describing for the GPA and what it is that we are seeing here in the United States around, call it regulatory cooperation, right? The sharing of either ideas or priorities or enforcement principles or what have you in either regions or across nations or, at least in the United States, across different types of states. I mean, it is certainly an area of perhaps new trends. And I'm interested in, hearing from you about what's driving that. Why is it that the country of, country X needs to look outside of its borders
Yeah.
to learn from what everyone else is doing, or to be able to adapt to how regulatory enforcement is being thought of in a different country that is subject to different stakeholders and perhaps different laws and different principles?
I would answer that question with one word: interoperability. And I think interoperability is important and certainly accelerated by everything that's happening in AI. Because when you think about AI, data is really the fuel that drives a lot of that innovation and development, deployment, certainly. But it is important that you maintain interoperability, number one, between or amongst international and domestic regulations. So you may, no man is an island. You may pass a certain law around AI or around data. That is not going to work without being sort of understanding how it interacts and works alongside international regulations of a similar nature. And similarly, the second aspect of interoperability would be between or amongst sectoral and comprehensive rules, whether it's with AI development or data protection. So I do see that interoperability underpins a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the developments, whether it's passing of regulations or certainly cooperating in an enforcement setting.
I love that as a goal. In practice, I think, we probably could all opine on how that's going.
Exactly.
Because I think we are seeing the world here of, on one hand, I think we would all agree that interoperability is something that is necessary to allow for global business in the way that we aspire to have that. At the same time, I think we are in the position where, in some ways, globalization is being reversed, and we are seeing strong trend lines in specific aspects where we are looking at localization, and we're going away from globalization. We're looking at requirements to house data within a specific jurisdiction. We're putting limits on how data may be transferred across borders. So I guess maybe, Eduardo, I'm interested in your thoughts about interoperability as being not only a theme that perhaps regulators can articulate, but what does that mean for the way that they develop and then importantly how they enforce their policies, given that in some ways there's a real difference and disconnect between what people would want their laws to be and perhaps how they need to interpret their laws as a reaction to public sentiment or whatever the news is of the day.
I think, look, you need to look at the reality of the world. We can come up with all these words about globalization or localization. What are the things about one or the other? In this trip that I made to Asia, after Seoul, one of the countries I visited was, of course, Singapore. And Charmian and I had lots of meetings with clients and local business people and privacy professionals and digital regulation professionals and so on. But the moment you step into Singapore, the very first thing you notice is that certainly globalization is very much alive. You know, you've got this country, and Charmian said, well, it's a small economy, but it's a booming economy. And the one thing that you notice is that it's a hub of trade and commerce and discussions and thinking and everything else that you can think of. And the reality is that the world is not less interconnected. It's not more separate. I know it's polarized, and politically that is a bit of a tragedy, but in reality, I go back to the reality of the world. The reality of the world is that we all communicate globally. Organizations and companies and businesses operate globally. And the internet, which has been around for a few decades already, facilitates that. And AI, which maybe has not been around for as long as the internet, but is going to replace it as technology, some of the things that the internet has allowed, or it's going to be based on the internet in order to enhance that, is global and relies on global data and actually facilitates that communication. So all of this is to say that when you face that and you are then trying to do business and you're trying to comply with laws are local. But what I see is that in the same way Charmian is talking about interoperability, another way of putting it is that businesses are looking for some kind of global baseline, some global baseline that is going to allow them to grow, to develop, to do things in the way they really want to do, and still, of course, complies with the law that they have to comply, but in a way that instead of being on a sort of country by country piecemeal basis, you approach it and say, okay, is there a way that I can adopt these measures that you guys, regulators, are telling us that we have to adopt, but instead of having to do it in different ways in different places, is there a way in which I can adopt these measures and actually get it more or less right everywhere? And I think that is the key. And when we talk about this idea of interoperability, that is in practice what that means. Finding that global baseline that a business can deploy and say, look, we're going to adopt these measures around the world, around our operations. They're not going to get in the way of innovation. In fact, we would say they are going to enhance innovation, because when regulators come and knock on our door, we say, thank you very much for coming to a place. Let us show you how we are enabling innovation here in a way that meets all these regulatory requirements. So I think that is the key.
I want to, add on to what Eduardo has shared. He said he was being philosophical, and maybe I will be now. But I do think that all the challenges we're seeing actually presents opportunities, because when we are seeing, kind of a very fragmented, sort of polarized, I think was the word used by Eduardo, world, then solutions that seek to kind of, in a way, pull things together and, in a way, integrate and to, create interoperability, that's where, if you solve for that, that would be an amazing achievement, right? An amazing feat. And so I think there is actually a natural draw or demand for solutions that provide those sorts of solutions and approaches. And I've mentioned one, which is the global CBPR, but there are others. And, if we are able to, in a way, navigate this well and effectively, certainly for clients, but also businesses that are able to tap into, say, for example, strategies that they've already deployed, say, for example, with data privacy compliance across the globe with AI governance, that sounds like a very sensible approach to go forward.
And I agree with the objective, and I think that is, how, I think the three of us and our colleagues here approach their advising of trying to come up with ways of doing one thing and accomplishing three objectives, right? Or having three different laws. How can I do not three different things, but one thing to accomplish all three of those? So from that purpose, interoperability makes a lot of sense, and I think is core to how we would approach this. the part that I maybe is new in the way that you're both describing it, and the part that maybe is one that we all have to be sensitive to as a trend, is that if the regulators or the lawmakers are the ones who are looking at how they are going to develop out their laws that apply inside of their country, that is designed to interoperate with the laws of other countries, is that something that we can anticipate will be a theme going forward? Because I think that, as probably we've seen that, and maybe in some ways with the export of the GDPR, where countries were taking and adopting their version of the GDPR to gain adequacy determinations, maybe thought of as largely an economic reason why they would want to do that. But in many cases, especially for the larger economies, I don't know that there was a real desire to even think about how these laws were going to interoperate. I mean, Eduardo, you'll tell me, but I think the focus for 10 plus years and the need for doing data transfer impact assessments was exactly the reason is that the United States, among us other countries, was adopting national security laws that were not consistent with, or arguably not consistent with, some of the tenets in the EU. And so it wasn't like those national security laws were being adopted really with any thought to how that was going to impact data movement across in and out of Europe. So if we're now thinking, hey, the regulators have gotten smart here and they realize that data inherently is global and doesn't stop at the boundaries or borders of a specific country, thus you need to come up with strategies to be able to allow for the laws of every country to uniformly apply and to work together, that would be really great, probably really ambitious, and maybe I'm a little skeptical that that would actually work. But Eduardo, your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, it is very clear that today's geopolitics are affecting all this, and we've discussed this in other podcasts, and that is a reality. But if we put the geopolitics just aside for a moment, and we just focus on the day-to-day of complying with the law, and of course, policymakers making new laws and regulators interpreting laws, what I do see is that certainly regulators are listening. That was the whole point of this conference in Seoul. They were saying to the world, we are listening, and we do have an opinion of our own and an objective that we think needs to be achieved, but we're listening in terms of how to achieve that. Policymakers in most parts of the world are also listening in terms of how they can contribute to, again, their own country's prosperities. And as part of that listening exercise, the opportunity for us as a collective is to try to ensure that, of course, laws exist for a reason, but laws can be made compatible with these type of things that we're talking about, of developing AI, using AI, and in innovation as a whole. The question is, how do we interpret these laws, or how do we make new laws that basically are allied with this level of innovation whilst still achieving the objectives they are trying to achieve? And of course, that's where the debate lies, and the different approaches. But if you start from the basis that you have regulators from, again, all over the world saying to us, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve. Tell us how best to achieve it. Tell us best how best to do pseudonymization or transparency, or what is in reality complying with data subjects' rights. How does that work in practice in the context of data that has already been fed to an AI algorithm, has already learned everything that had to learn, and the data is no longer there? How can a data subject say, okay, well, I want to exercise my right to object, or my right to erasure And how does that work in practice? And how can that be achieved technologically? That is where the discussion needs to be, so that dogmatic views don't get in the way of saying, oh, I'm sorry, but this technology cannot function, when in reality the technology is already operating. So that's the thing. It's a bit about conveying the right messages and trying to collaborate with these policymakers, with these regulators, making them understand what is possible whilst being receptive to what they are trying to achieve. And I think that's the key today.
So what that makes perfect sense in terms of, call it thought leadership, or, being able to educate one another about how to approach these technologies, which maybe everyone in the audience understands that some of these technologies are very complicated. Sometimes it's very difficult to try to understand how they all work, and to be able to get to even overcoming some of the language boundaries surrounding, how to approach the difference between algorithms and large language models and all of these things. But I think one of the things that I'm maybe we're wrap here is around how then does that influence and impact our clients in terms of enforcement priorities? Because one of the trend lines that at least I have seen here in the United States, I know it's true in Europe, Eduardo, and I'm sure it's true in your world, Charmian, in the Asia Pacific region, is that there's like this pile-on effect, right? It's like one regulator decides to go after a specific company, a specific practice, a specific type of industry, and then they all go after that one particular client, that one particular industry. And it's not even like it's a secret. In the United States, we have, publicly disclosed coalitions of states that are kind of bound together and have all indicated that they're going to work together for different types of enforcement, doing regulatory sweeps around different industries or different particular practices, and then going after organizations in that space. Eduardo, I know that the U.S. technology companies have long been the target in the EU for different types of their businesses. We saw that in connection with the early days of Gen AI, where there was this, all of a sudden, oh, there's Gen AI, and then the Italian regulators go, and then basically all the other regulators start to ask questions. So, how is it then that we are shaping kind of thought leadership around trying to say this is the best way of addressing this technology, versus how is it that we then just everyone decides they're all going to try to beat up one specific company as being the face of this practice that now has gotten all of this attention?
So enforcement happens when a particular conduct doesn't meet a particular rule. At its very basic, that's what it comes down to. You do something that doesn't comply with the law or infringes the law. There are two factors there. One is what you do, and another one is what the law says. So in an enforcement situation, our role in the context of what we're discussing is first to explain what that conduct, that whether you're talking of AI development or the deployment of biometrics or the use of cookies, whatever that action is, explain it in a way that goes beyond the imagination of a regulator that may think is one thing or another. So I think that's really, really important. But the other element, which is, I guess, where the lawyers come in, is to interpret the rules in the correct way. We have rules in our books that are being applied to these technologies that are being developed today that are 30 years old. Lawfulness under data protection law in Europe, or transparency. This is a rule that is 30 years old. It has to be applied in a way that works today in 2025. So I think that's where the interpretation of the law in a way that is, let's say, pro-innovation, in the sense that doesn't reject innovation for the sake of it, doesn't is not blind to innovation. It is adaptable so that that rule still achieves the purpose for which it was originally created, but it's not interpreted in a way that is so against the technology or against that activity, that conduct, that immediately says, I'm sorry, but you have broken the law. So I think that's where this idea of the discussion and the regulators listening plays out in an enforcement situation. And of course, at the end of the day, it's a matter of who is right and who is wrong, and that is all debatable in law. But that is where the work goes in the context of enforcement, making sure that people regulators understand the conduct in terms of what is happening, and also that the law is interpreted correctly. And if there is a disagreement between what a lawyer thinks and a regulator thinks, well, the court will sort it out. But I think that is where we are.
Charmian, I'll give you the last word here. I think this is obviously a fascinating conversation that kind of goes to the heart of the way that we approach data protection work, and importantly, how we are thinking about global data protection work. How do you see that developing in your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. But maybe before that, I just wanted to again add on my Asian sort of hat or perspective to enforcement, right? Priorities. What we are seeing is it is actually hyper locally nuanced. What do I mean by that? So, depending on where you are within APAC, you may have certain policy sort of concerns or objectives. In Singapore, even though, AI-generated synthetic content may be regarded as, say, of a lower risk category compared to some other more egregious type infringements, we actually view it as a problem because of the fact that we actually have a very high, unfortunately, a very high rate of online scams. So this is basically where, a lot of, users and a lot of citizens have lost money, right, to financial fraud and deepfakes, right, or AI-generated content facilitate that sort of criminal activity or behavior. So, that's just an example of how we may still take reference to something like the EU AI Act and, the risk categorizations there, but we do, at the end of the day, still have our own local priorities with regards to enforcement. And then I think just circling back to your question, what am I seeing? Well, I'm seeing, and we haven't really touched on this as much, but I'm seeing how we are facing sort of a ramping up of enforcement around cyber breach response or cyber incident response. And this is where, again, drawing all the themes that we've discussed during this podcast, the breach is global. There are no boundaries with regards to, how you can ring fence that it only happened in this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, the laws are state specific and they can be very hyper localized. We are acting in several matters at the moment where we're really trying to kind of like coordinate a wide scale, effort with regards to differing, timelines, language requirements, different forms and contents to report and to notify of an incident. And I think that that's going to be, unfortunately, a trend as more and more states hop onto the bandwagon and pass mandatory reporting requirements. So that's hopefully a good enough last word. And back to you, Scott.
I think that does it right. So, Eduardo, Charmian, really appreciate your time and sharing both your experience and expertise. I feel like every one of these conversations could probably go on for another hour or so. And I promise the audience it actually does when we're all together and we have, these types of conversations. But I'm really happy to share it with our Data Chronicles audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.